All right, we're back. Module. Today we're going to talk about energy. I have a passing interest in the issue, and you've actually done some research on it. So maybe you can do some education for me on the issue. I can pick your brain. I know, obviously, energy is very important, keeps the motor of the world economy running, and all our daily lives are touched by it in some way, shape, or form, whether at the gas pump or the supermarket. It's obviously a sensitive subject, being that fossil fuels are a hot button political issue in a number of ways, whether we're talking foreign policy, regulatory policy, or the environment. And so before we get into industry details, let's just get our bearings. Tell me a little bit about the global energy mix, what actually is oil and gas. Talk a little bit about that for me.
Yes, definitely. Energy is a topic that touches us all. So it's important to get on the same page and talk about what exactly energy is, the various sources, and the mix. So energy, when people think about energy, there's nuclear energy, coal, renewables, gas, and petroleum is the high-level mix. When we talk about oil and gas, excluding coal, which make up fossil fuels, there's three things that people need to distinctly be aware of. So there's crude oil, there's natural gas, and then there's what is called NGLs, natural gas liquids. These are all commingled and formed in the ground at the same time over millions of years through organic matter. So when you drill for oil, all these things come out depending on where you're drilling based on the geographical construct, come out at different proportions, but they do come out all at the same time. So they are commingled. Crude oil is the heavy, denser part of the liquid that comes out of the ground. Natural gas is on the other end of this spectrum and only comprises of methane molecules. And then there is NGLs, which include petroleum products, which we can go into detail later. If we look at the energy mix of the US, and I'm talking 2022, this data is available in the Energy Information Administration's website for our listeners to go look at themselves. 33% of energy consumption in the US was natural gas, 36% was petroleum, 8% nuclear electric power, 10% coal, and only 13% renewable energy, which includes all kinds of renewable energy, which includes solar, wind, biofuels, hydroelectric. So for all the talk in the popular press about renewable energy, it only still makes up in the low to high teens of the energy mix. If we look at the end use of energy, and now I'm talking crude oil here, transportation sector is the biggest user of crude oil. In fact, 90% of transportation sector energy comes from crude oil based energy. And while electric vehicle adoption is taking over quickly, the vehicle stock that we have currently in our roads will shift slowly because internal combustion engines have long lives. And then we can talk later also about how they're not good substitutes for all kinds of energy usage, especially jet fuel. There's not a good viable substitute because weight becomes an issue there. In the short term, based on my understanding, in the short to medium term, there is still going to be need for fossil fuels and energy. So as long as you're enjoying those Taylor Swift concerts and you're traveling for that, you are using energy and there is not a viable source depending on the mode of transportation you're taking. Lastly, last thing I will say here is just so we have scales roughly, and we're not being very precise with numbers, we're being tentative. On a given day in the world, there's about 100 million barrels of oil that is produced and consumed around that same number. And so the price adjusts based on supply and demand. But if you look at the global end use of crude oil, 44% goes into roads, 12% on aviation and marine bunkers, so your shipping. Then 14 some percent goes into petrochemicals, which is also used to make plastics. And then there are residential and electricity generation usage. I'll stop there.
That's a really great breakdown. I think that hits a lot of important points. In my mind, this brings up a little bit of the history of the US, and I'm not sure, how much you've heard about this, but like in the 70s, there was all this talk about peak oil, peak oil. I'm not sure if you've heard about this talk, but now, obviously we've transcended far beyond peak oil. There's some of these forecasts that we see out there are expecting, the peak demand for crude, they're putting some put it out like a couple years, but some people are putting it out a decade or 2 decades from now. And personally, I think just based on how that we've seen past performance, I would bet on some of the longer timelines. And I don't know if you feel the same way about that.
Yes, so historically, anytime there has been increase in production or supply, people have also happened to be found ways to increase their consumption of energy. So when you talk about peak oil, you think about all the things we have electrified our day to day, including our toothbrushes. All right, like our toothbrushes didn't necessarily used to be using electricity in the past, but now they could be. So similarly, as we electrify more things, unless that electricity generation on the background is happening through other sources, which again, in the US, still 60% of electricity generation is through fossil fuels. Thankfully, bulk of that is now natural gas, which is relatively speaking better for emissions. Peak oil doesn't seem to be here today or tomorrow, but it could be a medium term thing and not a long term thing, depending on how successful we are towards this energy transition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about as countries develop, there being an S curve type shape in terms of explaining the demand. So as the countries start developing, their demand is picking up slowly. They hit, kind of escape velocity, demand jumps up huge, but once they, are in a position like the United States, demand starts leveling off as the grid gets more and more electrification and more other things get introduced. Now, obviously, it'd be cool to see, more natural gas, more renewables, more nuclear as things going on. But really, what I'm thinking about in terms of the increase in demand over the next decade, 2 decades, is from other global sources like India and China.
Definitely. You bring this up. One interesting thing to consider is the energy mix of various countries. China still produces 60% of its electricity using coal, and proportion, and I'm not a coal expert, but there's grades of coals there as well. So in theory, a Tesla driving in Beijing could be polluting the environment more than a natural gas or other fossil fuel driven vehicle in the US. Again, not trying to be too precise here, but the mix of where your electricity comes from is important, not just the end result of what you do with that electricity. And that brings up another question, this S curve idea. Is it fair now for developing countries to slow down their industrial revolution when they themselves benefited from massive use of fossil fuels not that long ago in the grander scheme of things?
Mhm. So my perspective on that is that advanced countries, the country's leaders in the developing countries, I think they have political responsibilities, social responsibilities to try and increase growth as much as possible. Because the faster they can get through their growth phases, the faster they can get to cleaner energy systems. Whether it's moving from coal to natural gas or whether it's moving from fossil fuels to something else beyond that. And that's my perspective. I don't know, how feasible that is, or how much, or if there's investment to make that possible, or what the constraints are on that process. I think in an ideal place, we want to take places that are underdeveloped and find ways to develop them as fast as we can.
Are you talking about leapfrogging, like which happens in, say, communications and other sectors, where it's not like a country that lacked communication infrastructure has to now go back and like lay copper pipes in the
Mhm.
ground. They can
Right.
leapfrog that and go to fiber straight up. But doing so similarly in energy, how difficult or how costly it is, given obviously people are producing this oil. And so if more countries choose not to use it, it'll be cheaper for others that do decide to use it. So there's definitely a cost element there. There's equity and fairness element there, but at the same time, there is a global responsibility as climate change affects everyone regardless of their citizenship.
So I guess I was thinking along those lines. I think it probably depends on a country to country basis, but take for example a country like France where they do a lot of their electric generation from nuclear energy sources. Is there like essentially a comparative advantage type opportunity for certain countries where they can start doing most of their energy from nuclear or something? And I don't know if they would have the scientists or the infrastructure to do this, but say there are these sorts of cases where there is some sort of niche that they can exploit that then allows them to leapfrog, in your parlance, over some of the previous sort of slow walk developments that other places have done. I'm just thinking we just need to get, if we're going to say that most of the polluting is going to happen in the developing world, which is probably the case over the next however many decades or so on, and we want to try to allay that concern, then we have to find ways to get the new energy systems into these developing places faster.
100%. But if we look at the source, now touching quickly, let's go to the supply of this oil. Where is it coming from,
Yeah,
right? Are the developing countries themselves producing it? And if we look at a
right.
country level, the U.S. is actually, and we need to make aware, like of 2000, early 2000s revolution in shale, where horizontal, like historically, you drill vertically down into the ground and extract oil, but because of new technologies, horizontal drilling, also known as fracking these days, became possible, which made US actually the largest producer of crude oil. Now US has some standards and requirements, and there's always regulatory risk. So again, like just we have to remember that only refineries use crude oil. You and I at home do not use crude oil. We use refined products that come from boiling that crude oil at different temperatures, which yields different products based on density and have different use cases. So if we look at refineries in the US, in fact, we're very capacity constrained because refineries take huge capital investment and have long payback periods. No
Mhm.
one wants to take that risk given how the landscape could change based on administration or even sentiment and the development in other resources or substitutions. So given that there's no new refineries being built in the US, and so a lot of crude oil that US produces actually is exported elsewhere, and US then imports refined products. So this was to say that the production itself is not happening in developing countries based on price sources. I forget what exactly it is, but there is a price at which it makes sense for power grids to switch from coal to natural gas. There's some dynamics there. So as long as it's being produced, it's going to be used somewhere. Storage is also costly, and there's not infinite storage sources as well. Developed countries are still in the equation profiting
Mhm.
from someone else at the end using these products, including, of course, they themselves.
So many moving parts. I'm really curious about, the solutions around refinery capacity, because it does seem like such a choke point for a variety of reasons. But another interesting thing is that the fact that US is, such a major producer, whereas, go back, 50 years ago, like I was talking about in the 70s, OPEC's power was significantly greater because of the fact that the U.S. wasn't nearly the producer of fossil fuels that it is today. So that's obviously changed a lot of things globally from political perspective. To the extent that a group like OPEC could, have influence over prices, I imagine that's been cut into significantly. So obviously, I imagine that has a lot of effects across the board. So I guess I have two big questions around this. What's really the geopolitical landscape around these things? What has been the effects because of that? Back in the early 2000s, that obviously oil was, a touchy political subject too, with a lot of U.S. intervention in the Middle East. And what can be done around refinery capacity? Do we need to do something around refinery capacity in the U.S.?
Yeah, so starting with geopolitical angle here, we can talk not so long ago in 2022 when bulk of Europe depended on Russian gas
Yep.
for heating and other purposes. Now, gas, there's two ways to transport gas, primarily through pipelines, gas pipelines, and another one is called LNG, liquefied natural gas. Cool this gas to a certain temperature, the volume reduces by as much as 600 times, and so it makes it, then you have to take it in ships or bunkers like across wherever the final destination is. You have to regasify it. And had it not been for US LNG facilities, which are also going in full phase construction right now, Europe could have struggled, but thankfully that was not, that didn't wasn't the case. So energy has always been and probably will be going forward also, be a geopolitical tool of countries to influence each other, exert pressure, and also profit from. Um, and like you accurately pointed out, OPEC's power has certainly been reduced since U.S. production at scale came into being starting 2010 and on. And there's always been cheating incentives within this cartel that is now expanded to 13 countries known as OPEC Plus.
Hmm. All right. So I think a lot of everyday Americans, just people over the world, are concerned with access to cheap energy. So people want stability and they want low prices to access oil and gas or whatever the energy solution is down the line. So obviously then, supply matters a lot. So we want to know about the supply chain, the infrastructure of the supply chain. What are some of the geographical factors? As you mentioned before, we have to transport oil from where it's pulled up out of the ground to somewhere else. There's a lot of factors involved in that. Certain places in the US, which are very oil rich, or just the US in general, probably have nice, easy access to energy, but places that aren't oil rich, say like Europe, how do we get oil to them? What are these geographical factors, these infrastructure issues matter a lot. And I wanted your insight on some of these things. What do you think are some major issues that are facing us right now?
Sure, yeah. So if we look at the U.S., there's primarily 6 or 7 basins, which geographical construct the rocks, the shales from which bulk of the oil and gas is being produced. The Permian Basin is number one, and then Ohio and Pennsylvania has this Marcellus Utica shales as well. Because the production is happening only in a few areas, but consumption is happening throughout the country, obviously.
Mhm.
That means there's infrastructure required to get to the end use, but also the intermediate use, because crude oil is not what we're using. The refineries
Right.
are using the crude oil. Bulk of the refineries in the US are in the Gulf Coast. So that means
Mhm.
there's a lot of transportation happening, some underneath, and that's where the pipelines come in. These are midstream companies who are the players in this in the value chain. And these midstream companies lay pipes, although some oil transportation also happens through rail and some through trucks. But bulk of it, the cheapest way to do that is through pipelines. And there's miles and pipeline in the US connecting wellheads or NP companies. These are exploration and production companies connecting their output to refineries and then back into pipelines to get to various states for local distribution. One thing one has to be aware of, these pipelines have limited capacity at the end of the day. Getting new pipelines constructed has become increased challenge recently, and it requires a lot of permitting, going over some private lands at times. And there's always, in the past, you've read about the Dakota pipeline and various pipelines and the issues, political issues that come with it. So if the pipeline is constrained, sometimes producers are even forced to do flaring, which is simply burning of natural gas at the production, which is also not good for the environment.
Mhm.
Because again, all of these three things, crude oil, natural gas, and NGLs, the natural gas liquids, come out at the same time from the ground. So if you don't have infrastructure to transport gas, what do you do with the gas that is being pumped out at the same time you're drilling for oil? It
Mhm.
has to go somewhere. There's not necessarily storage facilities there. And so
Right.
there have been times companies are forced to flare this up. And then EPA has flaring standards, or like discourages flaring,
Mhm.
and it's not a good look for the companies as well. So we're definitely like infrastructure constrained. Some advances that are being made is there are LNG facilities, which is liquefied natural gas facilities that can liquefy this natural gas and ship it to areas of higher need. So on a high level, if you look at prices, Henry Hub in the US, natural gas prices are about $3, whereas the same gas could be sold at $11-12 in the US. Of course, that includes the cost of liquefying and regasifying at the other end, but
Mhm.
still, areas with need for this gas. So
Mhm.
infrastructure is being constructed. There are hurdles to create this infrastructure, and of course, energy. That's why is hotbed
Mhm.
political issue, and especially with the election coming up, will
Yep.
be an issue as well.
Yeah, and I think you meant Europe there in terms of the price difference, right? So you're saying that because of these infrastructure, these geographical constraints that exist in the supply chain, the same amount of oil gas here in the US is perhaps 3 to 4 times cheaper than it would be in Europe, for example,
Yeah,
also
yeah.
factoring in other factors. But that's right. So I've heard some counterintuitive things essentially about the upcoming election. Obviously, the layout is typically that, the Republican Party is a little bit more, at least rhetorically, favorable towards the oil and gas industry. Democrats a little bit more robustly supportive of environmental policy, regulation constraint in terms of kind of paring back and push renewable resources. That's kind of the simple story. And so people would think then that electing Trump in 2024 would be a boon for the industry, but some people counterintuitively say, "Am I not?" What's your perspective on, depending on the outcome in 2024, what maybe we see in terms of oil and
Yeah,
gas
yeah,
prices?
this is really interesting topic, right? I think both candidates present risk and opportunities for the industry, and it's definitely not straightforward.
Mm,
Why? Because yes, while Trump is pro oil and advocates for increased drilling and reduced regulation, that
mm,
also means increased production, which leads to the prices of the commodity going down, which is
mhm,
not necessarily favorable for the industry. On top of that, with Trump, there is possibilities for reintroduction of sanctions on Iran. But on the other end, there could be scaling back of sanctions on Russia, which are all also interesting dynamics. So the range of outcomes on a Trump presidency is much wider. Whereas
mhm,
Harris, like definitely supports stricter environmental regulations, but she also recently walked back her previous comments on how she favors a ban on fracking, presumably to lure Pennsylvania voters. And
yep,
when we talk about the industry, of course, jobs and people's livelihood come into question. And
mhm,
in the interim, what is a good solution? I'm no expert of it. But that means stricter regulation and means increased near term oil prices, which could be profitable for the industry. If we look at it under Biden, despite discouraging fossil fuel production, the industry saw higher cash generation due to higher oil prices and capital discipline than under Trump. So they're two different things, and those definitely play into the dynamics. Then there's the whole equation of China, one of the largest energy consumer in the world. Depending on what kind of tariffs are being applied in both directions, that also creates a wide range of outcome. And as you know, businesses prefer certainty over uncertainty or a wider range of outcome because it helps them
mhm,
plan more efficiently. So for the industry, it's not directly a straightforward answer as to this is better than this. Again, there's two aspects here. One is profitability, and one is more jobs, cheaper oil, different dynamics. And sometimes what could be good for the end consumer might not
mhm.
necessarily be good for the corporations running these billion-dollar companies, multi-billion-dollar companies.
For sure. And then I think we have some possible known unknowns to try to price in as well with the war in Ukraine and then, the possibility of a wider war in the Middle East. Are you aware of people trying to game out those sorts of scenarios and their effect on energy prices, oil prices specifically?
The production market is pretty fragmented nonetheless. So, like trying to
Sure.
gauge that out, I don't think it's hard, if not
Mm,
nearly impossible. There's too many variables and too many
mm,
players involved to
Mhm.
try to do that accurately. So no, I do not have a like strong
A good
opinion
forecast.
on that front. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this geopolitical commentator, Peter Zeihan, for instance, and he's very, I'd say, bearish on Chinese geopolitical prospects for one reason, because essentially of their lack of energy independence, and he's very bullish on Americans because of the shale revolution that happened in America. And I wonder to what extent we can expect maybe just a broader geopolitical stability too, if you know, we have impacts on the supply side coming from other global sources that maybe China could draw on versus the US sources. I don't know how much this is considered too. I think there's also like a second order thought here in terms of people using investment in oil and gas as a hedge against inflation, political instability in general. And I wonder, if you could maybe bridge those two for me. Do you think, say looking out 10, 20 years, say if US dominance of oil and gas industry and demand stays high, do you think that's good for, kind of stability in the world? Uh, if we don't see stability, do you think, you know, gobbling up, at, oil and gas assets is a good idea?
It seems that Middle East, which cumulatively is still large,
Yeah.
the largest producer, regionally
Mhm.
speaking,
Yeah.
has taken note and is already working on divesting from oil assets, using those
Right.
proceeds to buy other assets through various arms, various investment vehicles,
Mhm.
and
Pro-growth.
whatnot. And I'm hypothesizing here, but like if we look in and the resources are not infinite, right? These
Right.
take these oil resources at the end of the day take millions of years to form, and we only started like using it at this scale not so long ago. So the rate of new oil being formed versus the rate of consumption, by definition, there's finite resources. If we look at major players, like so many of them at current production levels only have about, depending on who we are talking about, 10, 11 years of reserves. Again, these individual level players, but like if we look at gas as a whole, I think last count was US had enough gas for 80 some years. So depending on what the long term is, and in the long, I love the phrase that in the long term we're all dead. But
Yes.
yeah, certainly there should be less and less. There should be a transition. There is a transition ongoing. So there is an interesting dynamic where demand of fossil fuels should decline given
Simply.
rise of other substitute, but at the same time supply maybe at that point is not decreasing at same pace, but is nonetheless like should be coming down, different depending on what basins you're talking about and what the costs are. After a certain point it's not profitable, like break evens
Right.
is what how the industry talks about it, right? So if it's below 50, maybe for some players it's just not profitable, the incremental production is actually losing money, and the industry has seems to have taken heed of this and is much more disciplined than it has in the past. So that's where I will leave it, as is like very interesting topic to consider. Certainly can be inflation hedge depending on where you what prices you get it. So if you look at from an investment perspective, how do you value these assets that they have underground, not knowing future prices?
Right.
So buying low is the only true hedge. What is buying low? Like what multiple? Like how many years of production is left? What margins are left? And you
Mhm.
like on a high level, again, this is very crude way of doing it. Yes, pun
Of course.
intended.
Yes.
So crudely putting, you slap up three if you can get a purchase stock or whatever investment in it is in a exploration and production company, three times multiple. Like again, there's so much more things to consider, and multiple. I'm saying, let's say the company has years, 10 plus years of reserves,
Mhm.
and you're buying it at three times current EBITDA multiples. Is like, again, we're not giving out investment advice here. This is certainly not
Right.
a podcast for investment advice. People should do their own research, but that's along the line of how I would point to it in terms of thinking. Is
Mhm.
there's this asset underground that takes costs to
Yep.
like bring up the ground and then market and sell it to the end consumer. It is a global commodity. Based on all the things we talked about, the usage is not going to zero like tomorrow or day after. Will
Right.
there come a day when like it will be vastly reduced? Yes, but that could be years away. And when you're buying assets at low multiples, like you're a little bit protected from that. But then there's other dynamics on this where there's, although in a free market, even if universities, because of student protests and all that, are forced to divest like endowments and everything, I would think there would be someone else buying it when the asset prices drop low enough. The gist of I think this talk is it's not so straightforward. We are not like climate change is a real issue, threat to everyone, but
Mhm.
at the same time, today and tomorrow we do not have viable alternatives. People need to travel to see their relatives for business and for other reasons. You have to heat your home, and yes, to the extent we can do it keeping costs low, that would be the right and greater thing to do. But there's not a great solution imminently. Doesn't mean we should fold our hands and do nothing, but we have to be aware, and saying outright ban or anything is only going to increase costs for people, which is also not in an inflationary environment. If your costs are going up, you have to feed your family today before thinking too much into future as well. So it's a very tricky topic, and I know I'm
Yeah,
dancing
yeah.
around both ways without taking a position, but such is the gravity of the topic.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people look at it as a kind of a straightforward thing, and I think there's a lot of underlying complexity there. I think we have a lot of surface level thinking about, climate change, energy, economics. There's a lot going on, and if we had
And
a good solution, we would already be
yeah,
using it, right? I mean,
and that's why
because
we need to drill down. No pun intended. On the topic.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of interesting possible things out there. I know there's, from a genetics perspective, you see some people talking about engineering fuels, essentially, like using genetic engineering to engineer plants or engineer bacteria to make, new biofuels, things that would replace oil and gas. There's optimism around that, although I don't know a lot about this work, but there's any number of unforeseen innovations that could blossom and change the space dramatically too at some point in time. I don't think those are immediately over the horizon, but
No.
I wouldn't say they're totally outside of the realm of possibility either.
Oh, no, yeah. And the world is big enough where, like, even if those become viable, can they be produced at scale to meet world's needs?
Right.
And so, like, but increasingly, if that displaces natural gas usage in developed nations, maybe that means natural gas like becomes more of an option elsewhere. So coal is replaced. So it's like
Mhm.
doing better is what's important. And so innovation and funding innovation along the space is critical to safeguard like the environment for our future generations as well.
Yep. Yep. Totally. Yeah, I think we hit a lot of the main points, and I think we can wrap up unless you have any final words on oil and gas. Any more puns?
No, no, no more puns. I try to be funny, but all I end up being is punny.
There you go. Lots of dad jokes. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for joining me and teaching me a little bit about energy, oil and gas module. Talk to
Thanks
you
for all the
later.
questions.